Hi, everyone. Welcome to Build. I'm Ethan Alter, and we're going to be here talking about Man in the High Castle. Now, for 3 seasons, this Amazon Prime series has transported viewers to a parallel America where Nazism triumphed and demagogues are in power. Like we said, it's an alternate America. Now, that other USA is now facing its own endgame with the premiere of the show's 4th and final season on November 15th. We've got cast members Joel de la Fuente and Frances Turner here to talk about it. But first, let's watch the trailer.
There are very few things in this world worth dying for. Those things do exist. But when there's something truly worth fighting for, you're gonna know it. Trust me. If the Nazis can be beaten in that world, they can be beaten in this one.
America is a rebel nation.
Only an American can truly control it.
The Reich murdered our sons.
These two empires that we fight for, they're little more than sandcastles. Only the tides are forever.
We are going to fight back. The Reich has built a portal to another universe. Millions of people are gonna die when your husband is in charge of it all.
You don't know my husband.
No, you don't know your husband. I've seen a lot of versions of my life. Each existence as real as the next.
This thing that we have been a part of, it has to stop.
I don't know how. Why did you come back?
To kill John Smith.
All right, let's give it up for Castle Keepers here, Frances Turner and Joel de la Fuente. Let's welcome them. So, final season, this is always a big deal for any show that's been on for years. And Joel, you've been with it since the beginning. What was it like coming into the season, knowing this was it, knowing this is the end game?
Well, it was great knowing that it was the end game. So we had some time to prepare and to sort of plot out how we wanted the stories to end, which doesn't always happen. So we feel fortunate that we've been able to wrap up the stories.
Right. What was it like sort of on the first day of shooting the final season? Did you have any sort of farewell rituals or anything like that you did as a cast?
It sort of felt like it was like a welcome tour and a farewell tour at the same time. I mean, for us, it's like, this is the last time we're shooting in this location. This is the last person I'm gonna execute, things like that.
Well, Frances, you are joining the season. What's it like joining a show that's at the end of its time?
Yeah, I feel very fortunate to have joined such a show with such a high level of storytelling.
Right.
So that was great for me to kind of jump in and try to meet them where they are. And Belle has her arc definitely has a beginning, middle, and an end.
Right.
And so she comes in at the right time and she makes an impact and serves the story. And again, it's a wonderful and epic conclusion. Yeah.
I always remember just watching that first episode of Man in the High Castle and just being transported completely to this other America. It's so enveloping and encompassing. It's been really interesting to watch how it's taken shape over the 4 seasons, exploring different aspects of it. Was there anything coming into it? Had you watched much of the show before? What was the element of the world that you were most disturbed by or more interested in?
Disturbed by?
Yeah.
I mean,
there's a lot, but is there one in particular?
To be disturbed by. I think the show does a really good job of painting 3-dimensional characters. And in doing that, you kind of self-examine, causes you to do a lot of self-examination about who you empathize with, why you empathize with their choices. It just makes you think a lot about what would I do in that situation. And so that's scary to think about, but also one of the beautiful things about the show, it challenges the audience to really think about those things.
Well, to that point, Joel, I mean, having played Keto over these 4 seasons, when you started with him in season 1 to where he is now, what's it been like to sort of get into the mindset of a character like that in this universe that is so different from our own and disturbing from our own?
In some ways, it's different from our own.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
I think when the series first started, there was a very sort of clearly drawn archetype of who Keto was, and I think the sense that we know who this person is, and I think to the credit of the writers and the creators of the show, the idea was, like Francis mentioned, to sort of start with sort of an angle on somebody, and then over the course of a season or multiple seasons, you sort of walk around that person and you see them from different angles, and you find yourself empathizing maybe at times when in surprising ways, and it causes you to ask, well, how did we get here? And I think we could all benefit, from asking that question. How do we get to where we are as personally and as a culture?
So to that point, what was the point where you empathized with Keto the most? Where did it click on in your head that I can see where this character is, or I understand him, I empathize with him?
Well, it was strange. It was when I first when I first was auditioning for the role, I felt like I identified with him completely from the beginning. Like I felt, which is unusual, this strong appetite to feel like I want to play this part, and I feel like I'm the person to play this part. I felt a certain kinship or ownership over who he was, and then that point of view was sort of shared by once I came on board. Our ideas about where we wanted it to go were similar, and so we worked towards that. So that was very fortunate.
Right. And how much of a role have you had in shaping Keto as he's evolved? Like, do the writers invite you in, for example, say, what would you like to see him do this season?
We're really lucky in the sense that from the beginning, it's been an extremely collaborative environment. They're always interested in I've never really had the experience to be around the kind of actors that we've been around on the show. Like everybody, there's such a strong sense of. I think Issa Dick Hackett, our executive producer, put it best. She said, "We are the custodians of our characters," and we are. And when you have a world this big and this sort of diverse and expansive, we all sort of become experts in certain things, and we are experts of our own characters. So they were very eager to help sort of collaborate and to steer, and I think it was a real collaboration top to bottom.
Yeah, it was similar for me, even coming in for the last season, there were a lot of discussions as the season went on, and I was able to give my input and ask questions, and some of those things found their way into the script, found their way into the story. Just awesome collaborators. Everyone from our executive producers, our writers, hair, makeup, wardrobe, production design.
Right.
It's just stunning storytelling, but how open they were to my thoughts was it was a pleasant surprise, because that doesn't always happen.
Right.
Yeah.
And we should talk about Belle's role in the narrative, which is because it's not an entire. It's teased a little bit in the trailer, but she's coming from an interesting place. African Americans in this reality have been essentially wiped out or hidden away from view, and she's making a stand to say, no, we're still here, we exist, and fighting back. What can you sort of talk about the creation of her role and how she'll play throughout the season?
So Belle, when we meet Belle on the show, she is living in San Francisco in the JPS, and she is a member of an emerging Black insurgent movement called the Black Communist Rebellion. And they are fighting for their own homeland, their own territory. And, Belle, the show, outside of Lem, you don't see African-American characters, Black characters on the show. And so, it's a very interesting and effective way to tell the story through Belle's character. Mm-hmm. Her backstory is she is from Alabama, so she's living in the part of the country that the Reich takes over when the Axis powers win the war. So, you learn through her backstory how she got from there to the JPS and how that fuels her fight and the fight of her fellow members of the Black Communist Rebellion. So, she puts one foot in front of the other in her journey towards their liberation, and we see where that takes takes them.
In the third episode, Belle there's a lot of activity in that episode. You have a very rousing speech. You take part in a mission to do something. Was that an exciting episode for you to do? Sort of seeing how she takes action.
Yeah. And most people won't know this, but that speech is actually a pretty famous poem by a Black poet, Claude McKay, who was a communist. So when I read that in the script, I got very excited because it's like, okay, yeah, this is specific and it's historical and it's real. That was a fun episode to shoot. But there was a lot of activity.
There's a lot of shooting.
There's a lot of
yes,
shooting.
Right, exactly. Quite a bit of bullets flying around.
But yeah, Belle definitely goes on a journey, and she ends in a very different place that she begins. So it's exciting to watch.
Right. And certainly one similarity between the two characters is just their commitment to their individual causes. The causes are at odds, but they are committed wholeheartedly to each of them. I mean, is that something, not that they would necessarily bond if they were to be, but do you see their similarities between the two in that commitment?
Buddy comedy.
Yeah, right, exactly.
We drive across San Francisco together.
Right. Well, I think you have it exactly right. Right? So they're committed to their cause, the same way Wyatt is committed to his cause. Everyone on the show is committed to their cause.
The power of belief, one way or another, and how a belief or an ideology can take you a certain distance, and how sometimes you can become trapped by that same ideology. Right. And what's interesting too about season 4 is you start to see, well, certainly for Keto, how his ideology comes into conflict with his own. He always thought his personal belief and his ideology were one and the same, and you begin to see how there starts to be an inner conflict that way, and I think that's an interesting conflict to have, especially with that character.
I think the what if aspect of history is always one of the most interesting things to think about, and shows like this really tease it out, and give you the chance to long form explore what if. Is there a particular bit of history that in the alternate timeline that's particularly persuasive to you, that you've come out saying yes, like even if some events didn't happen this way, this is one thing that could happen if certain things played differently?
The first thing that comes to my mind, I mean, it's all tied together also with the world building and everything, which is so specific. But I mean, this is a world where, among other things, it's like, when the war ended the way that it did, the civil rights movement never happened. Rock and roll never happened, and so when you just think of those forms of expression, I'm not you asked what things I would want to happen. This is obviously something that I don't, but it really makes you think and makes you sort of consider in our reality what we do have and the cost at which that has come and how easily it could go away and how it's being challenged even right now and the importance of not taking those things for granted and resisting and
fighting for the world that you want now, so you don't find yourself in the position where you have to make some of the choices that the characters on the show have to make.
Right. Yeah. I mean, sure, we're talking on a day where right now in Washington, D.C., certain things are happening. Let's say there's hearings going on. But I mean, as much as the show is about a past time, it also is certainly commenting on the present day. So has being part of that, a show like this, for instance, made you think about certain aspects of history playing out right now and thinking and seeing parallels between the fiction and reality?
Yeah, I mean, with a show like this, it's hard not to see the relevance. I will say for me personally as an actor, at the time this came for me, it gave me a place to put my frustration, to give it to the art and give it to Belle, and you've seen some of Belle, so you understand what I mean, just kind of resisting, So it was freeing for me for that standpoint. So it definitely came at the right time for me.
Right. You talked about Issa Dick Hackett, who is the custodian of her father's legacy. Philip K. Dick created the book and everything. What is she, in terms of approaching the show throughout its run, what has been her guiding principle that she's sort of communicated to you in terms of how it's passed from her father to her to the cast bringing it to life?
She's a remarkable person. She is a fantastic custodian of her father's work because, one is she's super intelligent. 2, she understands her father's work and is committed to understanding her father's work. 3, she's also committed to, when she shares it, as she said to me recently, she's not interested in finding people to just translate the ideas of the book one to one. She's looking for people that she trusts and can collaborate with to sort of take those ideas and bring them to the next place and where we are today. Case in point, Francis and I play two characters that aren't in Philip K. Dick's book. Right. They're creations of the people who have adapted the book, Issa being one of the supporters of that. So it's hard to find that balance between people who are knowledgeable of and protective of a work while also being open to and supporting the ways in which it organically changes when you bring it to a specific time and place. Right.
It's funny, just thinking of Philip K. Dick's continued relevance. As soon as the calendar turned to November 2019, everywhere on social media you started seeing Blade Runner memes pop up. Like we're now living in that future, just as you could see elements of this past in our future now too. So the prescience that Dick's books have, I think, it really speaks to that for sure.
Crazy.
So what can you tell us about where Keto's arc takes him in this season as it approaches? And are you satisfied with where he ends up, personally, having played him for so long?
It's such a weird time for us because having, I've worked on this character for 5 years, and I am satisfied with how it ends because, it's a big, huge world, and it's a cruel world, and lots of huge things happen, and I think he sort of, the things that happen to him match the size and scope of that world, which is as it should be. It's hard. It's hard to sort of say goodbye to something like that. I think it's time to say goodbye to it. But I think people will be, hopefully, people will be satisfied. It does reach its natural conclusion. I think what's different about this character compared to other seasons is you really do finally take a look at his personal life, how he is affected on a personal level, and how that comes to play with how he looks at the world. He changes.
I have to ask, what are some favorite series finales for you? I'm always a big fan of how shows wrap up. So, like, for example, I love Battlestar Galactica series finale. Lost, not so much. But, like, is there a
Breaking Bad.
favorite?
Breaking Bad,
Breaking Bad has
well.
a good one. Sopranos. So
I still love Sopranos. Sopranos. Yeah. The Wire. Wire was a great one for me. Yeah.
What are some of the elements that make a good series finale for you whenever there's been a show you followed and you're like, yes, that landed.
Francis Turner makes a good ingredient in a finale.
Yes, absolutely.
You know what it is? When I still wonder about the characters long after the series is over, when you wonder about where how their lives have evolved.
I love that so much. Like when I would read my favorite books, you think about the characters after, like what are they doing? Or I remember when I was a teenager watching Tootsie, the movie Tootsie, and they're walking away and then it freezes in the New York streets, and I was just so bereft and nostalgic about the idea of what happens after they froze, right. And if you can sort of create that feeling, if you can create that feeling of nostalgia in a dystopia, I guess, that's quite an achievement, but that's what we're hopefully trying to do.
Well, and are you still living with Belle? And do you think about her, even though you've wrapped filming? Like, did she come to you?
I think about her a lot because we've been
right now.
But I will say this, and this is something I've shared with others, that there was a certain point in the season, a few episodes in shooting, that it hit me, and I said, my gosh, Belle, she became my muse. I became so inspired by her, and I was learning from her. I was inspired by her qualities. Right. So, I just love her, and I hope everyone else loves her too, because she really does inspire me.
Joel, you wrote a really memorable essay about being an Asian American actor in the industry early on, trying to find
done.
trying to find your place. How do you feel seeing the way things have gone out? Have you noticed a change in the kinds of roles you're being offered, or anything that has the industry caught up? Do you think to from where you started out?
I don't know about catching up necessarily, but. We are definitely living in a different time than we were when I started acting 25 or 30 years ago. I think the concern of a lot of the writers who were Asian American at that time, we were still sort of writing about what that experience was. And I think today there's so much diversity among people who have been living with diversity for a long time, that they can talk about their everyday lives without necessarily having to address, like, we can sit here and talk about stuff, and my main reason for being here isn't because I'm Asian.
Right.
And yours isn't because you're African American or whatever, you know, like, we're a lot of other things. And I think that that shift in focus and the appetite for people to accept the fact that we look like the community that we live in and should be represented on screen is profound. And I think it's time, you know, and I think that we're living in a time too where people that look like me can see people on the screen and say, oh, that person looks like me. This way of living or this occupation is available to me. And I think that that was one of my dreams when I first wanted to be an actor too, was to sort of create, to help be part of a time where you could feel welcome and not excluded by looking at the screen. Like, you would see someone that looked like you on screen and not be embarrassed, you know?
Yeah.
So yeah, I think in that way it's changed.
Do you have a first memory of when you felt represented on screen, a character or an actor who was the one that put that in your head?
Well, George Takei in Star Trek was a big one for me. Pat, Marita in Happy Days. You know, they were people who, you know, George talked like the way I talked. You know, like and he was just doing his job. He wasn't, you know, his otherness wasn't the point of the story. So those are things that have nothing to do with George's acting or the storytelling he's telling it, but they are really, they tell its own story to people who are watching. You know, we always have to be aware that we're telling multiple stories. You know, what stories are we telling?
Yeah. Well, Francis, for you too, when did you feel represented on screen? What was the performance that clicked for you?
That's very easy for me. It was Blair Underwood in L.A. Law.
Okay. What was it?
Well, you know, that was one of the first 1-hour dramas that I remember like really being into as a kid. And then to see him, you know, this professional Black man who is suave.
Super handsome.
That didn't hurt. You know, and talented, just, you know, it spoke to me in a lot of ways. You know, that show was so great, it made me want to be an actor and a lawyer.
And you did both.
And I did both.
Right, yeah, exactly. So it must be in your head then too, knowing that this is going to be out there in the world, thinking about who is on the other side of the camera watching this, a Man in the High Castle, and maybe you could be that person for someone else.
Absolutely. I mean, I hope I inspire women, young girl. Well, you know,
Inspired me.
Yeah,
Right.
I'm inspired.
but I hope I inspire, you know, people that look like me. I hope I inspire women that don't to fight and use your voice.
And we should say, just in the context of sci-fi and genre, I mean, how a show like this can inspire people and also give them a way to think about history without doing it in the context of a history class. Is that something that being part of a genre show that you feel is speaking of Star Trek, that helps you really go to that?
I mean, I think sometimes learning can be at its most effective when you feel, right? So the chances that I will remember a lesson greatly increases if I feel it viscerally. So if I see a play about someone or a lesson, or I watch a show and I'm affected by it, I will tend to become interested in those things much more so than sitting in a lecture, you know, unless I'm affected emotionally by the lecture.
Right. Absolutely. Well, let's turn it over to the audience. We've got 2 questions for the audience. Let's call them up.
Hi, guys.
Hi.
Hi.
So I was wondering, since it is the final season, what has been one of your most memorable moments on set?
Wow. Let's see. One of my most memorable moments was, well, you know, I would have to say without giving any spoilers, there's a scene in the final episode, which was actually my last scene to shoot. And it's not my final scene on the show, but it was my last scene to shoot. And it was a culmination of, you know, Belle's arc of sorts. And, you know, I got to work with all of the recurring actors who had been with me this season and our local Vancouver background actors. And it was just, I was glad that that was my final scene, that I was with all the people that I had spent so much time with over 7 months. And I was just really, it left me in a real place of gratitude for what I had experienced. And especially when you see the scene, and you'll know it when you see it, the substance of the scene worked with that as well. So it was very poignant for me.
For me, I think it was, there's parts in the season where Keto is put in very vulnerable situations, and that was very uncomfortable for me, having played the part for a long time, because you never really see him emotionally vulnerable or physically vulnerable, and for a time he is both, and that was awesome. It was awesome to sort of be pushed off of the comfort zone and the expertise that you feel you've developed with a character, and then you suddenly, you're put in a situation where you don't know how you're going to respond, and that was exciting for me.
Okay, thank you, guys.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Got one more question?
Hi.
Hey.
Hello.
I was wondering, so with this show that explores a vast amount of historical context, but through a unique lens, how did you guys go about researching your characters or the world in general?
Well, what I did, so when I got the material for the audition, I had seen season 1 of the show. I caught up on season 2. But I also almost took myself back to middle school, like 8th grade social studies, and went through a refresher on the real history, how we got to World War I, how that took us to World War II, and the whole 9 yards. I also, so that I could really be specific about the context, and it being an alt version of that. I did research on the rise of Hitler, the rise of Nazi Germany, eugenics, anti-Black racism in Japan. I did a lot of research on Black power movements of the 60s. The character, Belle, she's very loosely based on Angela Davis. So I read her autobiography. I tried to get as specific as possible about the world and who the character was. And, that served me really well. Because the world building on the show, the production design is so detailed and it's such a high level that you don't have to, if you've done the work, you've done the research, you just step into a space and you're there. Your imagination, you don't have to use that much of your imagination to transport you, because you can touch it, feel it, smell it, taste it, it's all around you.
It's like a very specifically constructed playground. I did a lot of research before about the rise of the Japanese Empire, the reasons behind it, and then it took a couple of years of sort of back and forth and a lot of dialogue, but eventually we had a uniform timeline, so we could sort of explore, where was Winston Churchill, or who assassinated FDR in this world, like things like that, and then there's a character. There are several real characters, obviously, in our show to our timeline. But for example, like the rise of someone like George Lincoln Rockwell, who in our reality sort of exists as sort of a side, sort of clownish figure today, but he grew to a very scary figure in our show. So it's fun to sort of research to get yourself to the starting point, and then we have to listen real close to what everybody else is doing, so we're on the same page for the reality that we're creating.
Great, thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you so much for coming in today to talk about Man in the High Castle. Again, final season premieres November 15th, this Friday.
Thanks so much
Binge
for
the
having
final
us.
10 episodes.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot to these two.
Thanks, guys.